The pressure of their bodies formed a tight, suffocating circle around her. 3 of them, smelling of cheap beer and cheaper confidence, blocking her path from the sticky floor of the off-post bar. Lieutenant Marcus Cole leaned in, his breath a sour cloud. I said, "Are you deaf? Or just stupid?" Behind him, his friends snickered, their laughter like grinding gravel. Captain Anya Thorne said nothing. She kept her eyes fixed on the murky amber of the whiskey in her glass, her knuckles white where she gripped it. Cole's hand shot out, not to touch her, but to knock the glass from her hand. It shattered on the floor. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," his voice was louder now, drawing eyes from the other booths. He gestured to one of his smirking companions. "Davis, I think the captain needs a lesson in respect." "Slap the bitch," the words hung in the stale air, a physical weight. Thorne's posture didn't change, but something in the room did. A stillness. A shift in pressure, like the air before a lightning strike. She was cornered, outnumbered, and publicly targeted. What would you do in her position? Where are you watching from tonight? Comment your location below. If you believe that true strength isn't always the loudest voice in the room, hit subscribe. You're not going to want to miss what happens when a wolf in sheep's clothing finally shows its teeth. 2 weeks earlier, she had arrived at Fort Benning with a single duffel bag and a file that was 90% black ink. The morning fog hung thick enough to taste metal, clinging to the Georgia pines that lined the entrance to the advanced leadership course. Captain Anya Thorne looked like a ghost, a temporary attachment who didn't belong. She wore simple, unadorned fatigues, her hair pulled back in a severe, functional knot. There were no decorations on her uniform, no signifiers of rank beyond the twin silver bars on her collar. Lieutenant Marcus Cole had sized her up in less than 10 seconds. Too small, too quiet. He saw the faint, silvery tracery of a scar that disappeared beneath her hairline and the way her left hand sometimes trembled almost imperceptibly. He saw a diversity hire, a broken soldier pushed through the system to fill a quota. He didn't see the way she mapped every exit in the briefing room, or how her eyes tracked the instructor's movements with an unnerving, predatory stillness. From his second-story office overlooking the training grounds, Colonel Whitaker watched her step off the bus. He saw what Cole missed. The economy of her movement. The precise, almost obsessive way her gear was arranged. He'd read her real file, the one that required 3 separate clearances to open. He knew exactly who, and what, had just walked onto his base. He just wondered when everyone else would find out. The first major exercise was a squad-level urban assault simulation. The air was thick with the pop-pop-pop of blank rounds and the acrid smell of smoke grenades. Cole's team moved with textbook aggression, all loud commands and dynamic entry. Thorne was assigned to a different squad, her role as rear security. Then came the explosion, a simulated IED that sent rubber debris and a deafening boom through the concrete corridor. Everyone reacted, diving for cover, returning fire at imagined enemies. Everyone except Thorne. She froze. For 3 full seconds, she stood perfectly still amidst the chaos, her rifle held at a low ready, her eyes distant. Cole, observing from a catwalk above, laughed. "See that? She's broken," he muttered to another lieutenant. Completely useless, the evaluator marked her down for failure to react, but Master Sergeant Jensen, a man who had forgotten more about combat than Cole would ever know, saw something else. It wasn't a freeze of panic. It was a moment of absolute, chilling calculation. In those 3 seconds, he saw her head tilt, her eyes cataloging the blast pattern, the trajectory of the shrapnel, the structural weaknesses in the ceiling. It wasn't fear. It was analysis. It was the cold, hard muscle memory of 100 real explosions, and for a terrifying instant, Jensen felt like he was the one being evaluated. Cole's condescension metastasized from private mockery to public harassment. During a classroom lecture on counterinsurgency tactics, he raised his hand. "Sir, with all due respect to Captain Thorne," he began, his voice dripping with false sincerity, given her performance in the last sim, where she demonstrated a clear inability to function under pressure, is it really appropriate for her to be in a leadership course? The instructor, a major who valued bluster over substance, was taken aback. All eyes turned to Thorne. She didn't flush with anger or embarrassment. She simply turned her head slightly to look at Cole, her gaze level. "Pressure is relative, Lieutenant," she said, her voice quiet but carrying across the room with unsettling clarity. "Some things look like hesitation from the outside," Cole scoffed. "Hesitation gets people killed, Captain." Thorne's eyes held his for a beat longer. "So does arrogance." The room was silent. Cole had expected her to crumble, to defend herself, to show weakness. Instead, she had returned his volley with a single, perfectly aimed shot that left him feeling strangely exposed. He mistook her calm for passivity, her precision for weakness. It was a mistake he would continue to make, each time escalating his efforts to break the silent, unassuming woman who so thoroughly unnerved him. That night, sleep offered no refuge. She was back in the Karengal Valley, the air tasting of dust and burning diesel. The memory was not a movie she watched, but a place she inhabited. The weight of him was real, the slick warmth of blood soaking through her uniform. Sergeant Keene, his face pale under a layer of grime, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. He had been her point man, her shadow, the one who always had a dry joke for the worst moments. The IED hadn't been a simulation. The shrapnel was real, a storm of jagged steel that had torn through him. She had her hands inside him, trying to hold together what could not be held. "Promise me, Anya," he'd whispered, his voice a thread. "Promise me you'll teach them. Don't let them make my mistakes." His eyes were wide, fixed on something she couldn't see. She had held him, rocking him gently as the life seeped out of him onto the thirsty Afghan soil. "I promise, David," she had choked out. The explosion hadn't broken her. It had forged her. The freeze others saw as fear was her mind replaying that moment, honoring that promise by analyzing every variable so no one under her command would ever have to die like that again. The scar on her temple was from a piece of the Humvee. The tremor in her hand was the ghost of his fading pulse. Colonel Whitaker sat in his office, the only light coming from the green glow of his monitor. He had Thorne's complete, unredacted file open. Unit, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Deployments, 17, all classified. Commendations, a list so long it required its own annex, including a Distinguished Service Cross that was never made public. The report on the incident in the Karengal was clinical, devoid of emotion. It detailed how, after Sergeant Keene's death, Thorne had single-handedly held off a flanking ambush for 2 hours, coordinating air support while simultaneously treating 2 other wounded soldiers. The report concluded she was operationally exceptional but recommended a non-combat rotation for psychological evaluation and recovery. This course wasn't a test of her skills, it was a test of her composure. They wanted to see if she could reintegrate, if she could lead in a conventional environment without the razor's edge of black ops defining her every move. Whitaker closed the file. He'd seen operators like her before. They were quiet storms, forces of nature compressed into human form. Cole was a gnat buzzing around a hurricane. Whitaker made a decision. He would not intervene. Not yet. Thorne wasn't a soldier who needed protecting. She was a weapon, and he trusted her to know when to deploy herself. He would simply watch, and wait. The final field exercise was a grueling 20-mile land navigation course through the dense, swampy woods of the training area. It was a test of endurance, skill, and integrity. Before they set off, as soldiers checked their gear, Cole saw his chance. While Thorne was being briefed by an instructor, he casually bumped into her pack, and with a movement too quick to be noticed, he used a small knife to nick the strap of her compass, nearly severing it. He also loosened the battery cap on her GPS just enough to break the connection. It was petty, childish sabotage, born of a desperate need to see her fail. The course was brutal. The humidity was a suffocating blanket. Thorne realized her equipment was compromised within the first hour. Her compass strap broke, sending it into a murky creek. Her GPS was dead. For a moment, she felt a flash of hot anger. But it passed, replaced by a cold, familiar calm. She fell back on older skills. The position of the sun. The growth of moss on the trees. The subtle topography of the land. She moved slower, more deliberately. Cole and his team finished first, striding into the final checkpoint with boisterous confidence. Thorne stumbled in 3 hours later, last, covered in mud and insect bites, looking utterly defeated. Cole smirked, feeling a surge of vindication. Master Sergeant Jensen watched her approach, saw the deliberately frayed compass strap she held in her hand, and knew. He didn't have proof, but he knew. And so they ended up at the bar. A loud, raucous celebration for the end of the course. Thorne sat alone in a corner booth, nursing a single whiskey, intending to stay just long enough to be polite. But Cole, his ego inflated by his victory and fueled by alcohol, couldn't leave it alone. He needed a public concession. He needed to make her acknowledge his superiority. He and his two most loyal sycophants, Davis and Miller, approached her table. The initial confrontation was quiet, a low murmur of insults she ignored. But her silence was a canvas onto which Cole projected his own insecurities, and he saw it as defiance. That's when he knocked the glass from her hand. His voice rose, a peacock fanning its feathers. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he was performing for the crowd now, for the other officers who saw him as a leader. He was establishing the pecking order. He gestured to Davis. "Davis, I think the captain needs a lesson in respect." "Slap the bitch," the phrase, ugly and sharp, cut through the noise of the bar. It was the second time he'd said it. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Davis, eager to please his superior, took a step forward, his hand raising, his face twisted in a smug grin. The world seemed to slow down. For Thorne, the bar, the music, the faces all faded away. There was only the raised hand, the sneering face, and the echo of a promise made to a dying man. The trigger wasn't the insult. It was the command. The casual order to inflict violence, given by an officer who had never earned the right to lead anyone. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, Anya Thorne ceased to be a quiet captain in a leadership course. She became something else entirely. As Davis's hand swung toward her face, her left hand, the one that sometimes trembled, shot up. It didn't block the blow, it caught it, redirecting his momentum with fluid, effortless grace. Her fingers, impossibly strong, clamped around his wrist. Her right hand moved simultaneously, not in a punch, but as a lever. She dropped her center of gravity, twisting her body. It was a simple, brutal application of physics. A standing armbar takedown. The sound was not a loud crack, but a sickening, wet pop as Davis's elbow dislocated and his radius fractured. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony, and crumpled to the floor. Cole stared, his drunken haze evaporating into shock. He lunged forward, not with any skill, but with raw fury. Thorne moved to meet him. She didn't retreat. She flowed into his attack, using his own weight against him, spinning him around and slamming him face first into the wall. In the chaotic scuffle, the sleeve of her right uniform jacket, already strained, tore open from shoulder to elbow, revealing the skin beneath. And there it was. Inked in stark black against her skin was the unmistakable emblem, a downward-pointing dagger superimposed over an arrowhead, flanked by a pair of wings. The quiet tattoo of the Army's most elite, most secret unit. The symbol of Delta Force. The bar fell into a cathedral-like silence, broken only by Davis's whimpering on the floor. Every eye was locked on the tattoo now visible on Thorne's arm. The symbol was a ghost story, a legend whispered about on bases around the world. To see it on this quiet, unassuming woman was like finding a shark in a fishbowl. The front door of the bar swung open, admitting Colonel Whitaker, followed closely by Master Sergeant Jensen. They moved with a purpose that parted the stunned crowd. Whitaker's eyes took in the scene in an instant: Davis on the floor, Cole pressed against the wall, and Thorne, standing calm and centered in the middle of it all, her torn sleeve a declaration. He ignored everyone else. His gaze locked on Thorne. "Valkyrie," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. It wasn't her name. It was a call sign. A name earned in blood and fire. "Stand down." Thorne's posture softened instantly, the lethal tension draining away as if a switch had been flipped. She released Cole, who slid down the wall, gasping. Whitaker walked forward until he was standing over the humiliated lieutenant. "Lieutenant Cole," he said, his voice dangerously low, "you have just assaulted a decorated operator of a special missions unit. You did so after weeks of unprofessional harassment and the deliberate sabotage of her equipment. You are a disgrace to that uniform and to every soldier who has ever served with honor." He turned to Jensen. "Master Sergeant, get these two idiots to the MPs. Then get the rest of these officers back to base." "Their party is over." As the room cleared, Whitaker turned back to Thorne. He looked at her torn sleeve, at the exhaustion in her eyes. "Your evaluation is complete, Captain," he said, his tone softening. "Welcome back." She simply nodded, the quiet returning. It wasn't anger she felt, looking at Cole's crumpled form. It was pity. A deep, profound pity for a man who had never understood that the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield is the one you underestimate. The institutional fallout was swift and decisive. Lieutenant Marcus Cole was not court-martialed. That would have drawn too much attention to Thorne's classified background. Instead, he was stripped of his pending promotion and reassigned to a remote logistics depot in Alaska, tasked with teaching a mandatory course on professional ethics and respect in the ranks, a lesson in humility he would have to learn by teaching it every day for the next 3 years. Davis and Miller received similar, less severe punishments. Colonel Whitaker used the incident to implement a sweeping change in the Advanced Leadership course curriculum, adding a new block of instruction called Threat Assessment Beyond the Obvious, focused on recognizing capability regardless of gender, size, or demeanor. He used the anonymized data from Thorne's failures as a case study in cognitive bias. 3 months later, Captain Anya Thorne stood on a platform at Fort Benning, overlooking a new class of aspiring leaders. She wore a crisp instructor's uniform, her sleeves rolled down. She wasn't an operator anymore, not in the field. She was something more important. She was a promise keeper. She looked out at the sea of eager, nervous faces, and her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it carried the weight of experience, of loss, and of a profound, unshakable strength. "Your first lesson," she began, "is that you know nothing. Your assumptions are your biggest enemy. The person you dismiss today might be the one you depend on to save your life tomorrow." Her mission was no longer about winning battles. It was about forging the leaders who would. And in the quiet dedication of her new role, she found a peace that victory alone could never provide. If you believe one person can change a system from the inside, share this story. True leadership isn't about being the loudest. It's about being the one who listens, who sees, and who empowers the strength in others.